You're a 7-year-old boy in a small Bulgarian village in 1550. The morning mist clings to the valley like a shroud as you help your father tend to the sheep. The bells around their necks create a gentle melody that has been the soundtrack to your entire life. Your mother is preparing breakfast, warm bread and goat's milk that tastes like home, like safety, like everything you've ever known. The wooden cross your grandmother carved hangs around your neck, catching the early sunlight as you chase a lamb back toward the flock. Then you hear it. The thundering of hooves against cobblestone, echoing off the mountains like thunder before a storm. Your father's face goes white as parchment, his weathered hands trembling as he drops the shepherd's staff he's carried for 20 years. Your mother appears in the doorway, flour still dusting her apron, and the clay pitcher slips from her fingers, shattering across the threshold like your world is about to shatter. Because everyone in your village knows what those hoofbeats mean. The Sultan's collectors have come for the Devshirme, the blood tax that has haunted Christian families across the Balkans for generations. You watch from behind a wooden cart as Ottoman officials dismount their horses, their silk robes pristine despite the long journey from Constantinople. They move with the practiced efficiency of men who have done this hundreds of times before, in hundreds of villages just like yours. The lead official unfurls a scroll, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. He speaks in Turkish, but the village elder translates with a voice hollow as an empty tomb. They have come to collect the tribute owed to the Sultan. Not gold, not grain, children. Your neighbors emerge from their homes like ghosts, mothers clutching their sons, fathers standing helpless, with hands that know how to work leather and wood, but cannot fight an empire. The officials carry more than scrolls and lists. They possess detailed records, showing exactly how many Christian families live in your village, how many boys of the right age are available, when this village last contributed to the levy. They have spreadsheets of human misery, tracking children like livestock across their vast empire. This isn't random violence or the chaos of war. This is systematic harvesting, conducted with bureaucratic precision that makes it infinitely more terrifying. When one of them points directly at you, your mother collapses to her knees in the dirt, begging in a mixture of Bulgarian and broken Turkish, offering everything she owns, everything she is, to spare her child. But the officials don't even acknowledge her pleas. They've heard the same desperate bargains in Greek, Serbian, Albanian, and a dozen other languages. Parental love is just background noise in their well-oiled machine of acquisition. Your father stands silent, knowing that resistance means death for the entire family. The Ottoman Empire doesn't tolerate defiance, and villages that resist the Devshirme are burned to ash, their populations sold into slavery or worse. He has seen the charred remains of settlements that dared to hide their children or fight back. Cooperation is the only path that leaves anyone alive, even if it means sacrificing what they love most. You are torn from your mother's arms with promises wrapped in silk and poison. They tell your parents that you will serve the Sultan, that you will rise to greatness in the empire's service, that this is an honor beyond their humble comprehension. They speak of education and opportunity, of a future more glorious than anything a shepherd's son could dream. The lies fall from their lips like honey from a broken comb, sweet but poisonous, designed to make your parents feel gratitude instead of rage for this monstrous theft. As the cart rolls away from everything you have ever known, your mother's sobs fade into the distance, mixing with the cries of other children who will never see their families again. You clutch the wooden cross at your neck, not knowing that by tomorrow it too will be torn away, along with your name, your language, your memories, and every trace of the boy you once were. This was the beginning of your new life in the most powerful empire on earth, and the horrors that awaited you behind the golden walls of Ottoman palaces would make you long for those simple days watching sheep in the misty valleys of your homeland. You were about to become a ghost in your own body, a living instrument shaped by forces that viewed human souls as raw materials to be molded, broken, and rebuilt according to the empire's darkest needs. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. and please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you're about to discover isn't just another tale of historical cruelty. It's the systematic documentation of how an empire weaponized childhood innocence, turning the most vulnerable members of society into instruments of power, pleasure, and political control. The Ottoman Devshirme system wasn't an aberration or a footnote in history. It was a cornerstone of imperial policy that shaped the lives of millions and created traumas that echoed across generations, leaving scars that some communities carry to this day. The journey to Constantinople was your first taste of the systematic cruelty that would define your new existence. You and dozens of other boys, some barely old enough to walk, were marched for weeks across rugged terrain, inadequately fed, sleeping in the open or in crude shelters that offered little protection from the elements. The weak ones, those who couldn't keep up, who fell ill or who simply gave up hope, were left behind to die. You learned your first lesson in Ottoman palace life before you even reached the capital. Weakness was death, and only the strongest, cleverest, or most adaptable would survive what was to come. The boy walking beside you, maybe 14 years old, had been taken from a Greek fishing village. His name was Nikos, though he whispered to you that soon that name would be forbidden, erased like footprints in sand. He had tried to escape on the third night of the march, but the guards caught him before he made it a mile from the camp. They dragged him back and beat him in front of all the other boys as a lesson, his screams echoing across the countryside while you squeezed your eyes shut, trying to block out the sound. But you couldn't block out the lesson. Escape was impossible, resistance was futile. What made the Devshirme system particularly horrifying wasn't just its brutality, but its meticulous organization. The Ottoman Empire had perfected the art of human acquisition over centuries, creating a bureaucratic machine that operated with the efficiency of a modern corporation. Provincial governors received detailed quotas specifying exactly how many boys they needed to deliver each year. Village registers documented every Christian family, tracking the ages and number of male children with mathematical precision. The selection process was methodical and cruel, designed to identify not just healthy boys, but those with specific qualities the empire required. Officials examined each child like they were purchasing horses, checking their health, their intelligence, their physical development. They looked for signs of quick wit, physical beauty, and that indefinable quality they called potential. The spark that could be shaped into absolute devotion to the Sultan's will. Boys who showed too much spirit were noted as requiring special breaking. Those who seemed too broken already were dismissed as useless. But here's what makes this practice particularly soul-crushing. These children weren't being taken to die in mines or fields. They were being acquired for something far more intimate and devastating. The brightest and most attractive boys would be sent to the palace school, the Enderun, where they would undergo a transformation so complete that their original selves would cease to exist. The process wasn't just about converting religion or changing names. It was about complete psychological reconstruction, turning traumatized children into willing instruments of imperial power. The documentation that survives reveals the cold arithmetic of this human harvest. Ottoman records show that between 1,400 and 1,600, approximately 200,000 Christian boys were taken through the Devshirme system. That's roughly 1,000 children every year for 2 centuries, stolen from their families with bureaucratic precision. Each boy represented not just an individual tragedy, but the destruction of entire family lines, communities left hollow by this systematic theft of their future. The immediate separation was calculated to maximize psychological damage. Children were immediately divided by language groups and scattered across different units, ensuring that no boy could find comfort with someone who shared his memories or spoke his native tongue. Within days, most couldn't even communicate with each other except through the broken Turkish they were being forced to learn. The empire understood that language was the pathway to memory, and memory was the enemy of transformation. The conversion ceremony was designed as psychological theatre, a public demonstration of the child's death and rebirth. Your wooden cross was torn from your neck and burned before your eyes while you repeated words in Arabic that you didn't understand. Your Christian name was declared dead, replaced with something Turkish and Islamic. But the most devastating moment came when you were forced to spit on a crucifix, an act that shattered whatever remained of your connection to the boy who had herded sheep in a Bulgarian valley. The new identity wasn't just imposed, it was carved into your consciousness through a combination of reward and punishment that would make modern psychologists weep. Boys who embraced their new Muslim names and showed enthusiasm for Islamic prayers received better food, warmer clothes, and protection from the worst abuse. Those who clung to their Christian heritage faced systematic torment designed to break their spirits without damaging their bodies. The empire needed them functional, after all. The palace dormitories where you now slept stretched before you like marble tombs, lined with narrow beds covered in silk that felt like chains against your skin. Your first night, you lay awake listening to the sounds that would become the soundtrack of your imprisonment, the soft sobbing of homesick boys trying to muffle their tears in their pillows, whispered conversations in languages you didn't recognize, and the footsteps of older students and supervisors prowling the halls after lights out. The hierarchy within the school was deliberately complex, designed to create competition and prevent solidarity among the boys. Older students who had successfully adapted to the system were given authority over newcomers, becoming both tormentors and protectors depending on their moods. They understood the psychology of broken children because they had once been broken themselves, and many used this knowledge with casual cruelty. Ahmed, an older boy who had been in the system for 3 years, approached you during your first week. His original name, he whispered, had been Stefan, and he had come from a Serbian village not far from your own. But that boy was dead now, he explained with eyes that held depths of pain impossible for someone so young. The Empire had killed Stefan and built Ahmed from his remains. Now Ahmed served as an interpreter of survival, teaching newcomers the unspoken rules that determined who lived and who simply disappeared. The most insidious aspect of the Devshirme system was how it turned victims into perpetrators. Boys who survived the initial trauma and adapted to palace life often became the ones selecting the next generation of victims. The Empire would send them back to the Balkans as adults, pointing out the most attractive children in villages like the ones they had once called home. They had become living weapons in the Empire's war against childhood innocence, their own trauma transformed into a tool for creating new trauma. The psychological techniques used were sophisticated beyond anything the contemporary world understood about human behavior. The Empire had discovered that complete isolation from familiar culture, combined with the promise of advancement through submission, could remake a human personality at the deepest level. They created environments where collaboration with the system wasn't just rewarded, it became the only path to psychological survival. What emerged from the Enderun weren't just trained administrators or military officers. They were human beings whose capacity for normal emotional attachment had been systematically destroyed and rebuilt around loyalty to the Sultan. The Empire had perfected the art of creating devoted servants by first annihilating everything that made them human, then carefully reconstructing new identities that served imperial needs. The boys who emerged from this process weren't victims in any recognizable sense. They were grateful to the system that had destroyed them, proud of their service to the empire that had stolen their childhoods, and genuinely convinced that their suffering had been necessary for their elevation. The most successful graduates would return to raid new villages, seeing fresh terror in young faces and feeling nothing but professional satisfaction at a job well done. The whispers began on your 3rd week in the Endron school, hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when supervisors appeared. The older boys spoke of a selection that was coming, one that would determine not just your future role in the empire, but whether you would remain whole in body as well as spirit. You didn't understand what they meant until Ahmed pulled you aside one evening, his face grave with the weight of terrible knowledge. "Some of us will be chosen for a different kind of service," he said, his voice barely audible in the marble corridor. "The most beautiful ones, those the palace physicians deem suitable for the Sultan's most intimate chambers." The way he said suitable made your skin crawl, though you couldn't yet grasp the full horror of what he was describing. "They will make sure you can never father children never know a woman's touch, never be anything more than an ornament in the Sultan's collection. The selection process for castration was conducted with the same bureaucratic precision that characterized everything in the Ottoman system, but with an added layer of clinical detachment that transformed human beings into medical specimens. Palace physicians examined boys with the thoroughness of horse traders, measuring not just physical development, but evaluating what they called aesthetic potential, the likelihood that a child would grow into the kind of beauty that could ornament imperial chambers. They kept detailed records of these examinations, documents that survive today in Ottoman archives like inventories of human livestock. Height, weight, facial symmetry, skin tone, voice quality, everything was measured, catalogued, and assessed for its potential contribution to the Sultan's pleasure. Boys who showed signs of developing into what the physicians considered masculine features were typically assigned to military training. Those blessed or cursed with more delicate features faced a far different fate. The empire maintained castration centers in Cairo and Alexandria, strategically located outside Ottoman territory to circumvent Islamic prohibitions against the practice. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. The same empire that proclaimed itself the defender of Islamic law routinely violated that law by having Christians and Jews perform operations that were forbidden to Muslims. They had created a theological loophole that allowed them to commit atrocities while maintaining the fiction of religious purity. The journey to these castration centers was itself a form of psychological torture. Boys selected for this fate were told they were being honored with special training, that they would serve in the most sacred precincts of the palace, closer to the Sultan than any other servants. The lies were carefully constructed to prevent panic and resistance during the long journey south. Many boys arrived at the castration centers still believing they were destined for administrative roles or advanced education. The facilities in Cairo operated with industrial efficiency, processing hundreds of boys each year in what can only be described as assembly line mutilation. The mortality rate was staggering. Historical accounts suggest that only 1 in 10 boys survived the procedure. Think about that mathematics of horror. The empire was so committed to acquiring eunuchs that they were willing to kill 9 out of every 10 boys to get 1 survivor. The procedures varied depending on the boy's intended role within the palace hierarchy. African boys, typically acquired through raids into Sudan and Ethiopia, usually had their entire genitalia removed in operations of almost unimaginable brutality. These boys, if they survived, became what the Ottomans called black eunuchs, considered more trustworthy around the Sultan's women because their complete emasculation supposedly eliminated any possibility of sexual desire. European boys from the Devshirme system usually underwent partial castration, having only their testicles removed, while their penises remained intact. These white eunuchs were deemed suitable for administrative roles where complete emasculation wasn't considered necessary. The empire had created a hierarchy of mutilation, carefully calibrated to produce different types of servants for different imperial needs. The actual procedures were conducted without anesthesia, using crude instruments that were rarely cleaned between patients. Boys were held down by assistants while surgeons worked with knives heated red-hot to cauterize wounds and prevent immediate death from blood loss. The screams could be heard for miles around the castration centers, creating an atmosphere of perpetual horror that even hardened residents of Cairo found disturbing. Those who survived the initial operation faced weeks of recovery in conditions that can only be described as medieval. They were buried up to their necks in sand, both to immobilize them and to use the sand's supposed healing properties to prevent infection. Many who survived the surgery died during this recovery period from infections, dehydration, or simple despair at what had been done to them. The psychological impact of castration extended far beyond the physical trauma. These boys hadn't just been mutilated, they had been severed from any possibility of normal human relationships for the rest of their lives. They could never marry, never father children, never experience the most fundamental aspects of adult human connection. They existed solely to serve an empire that had stolen not just their freedom, but their basic humanity. Mehmet had been Dmitri when the collectors found him in his Albanian village, a boy of 12, whose crime was possessing the kind of ethereal beauty that caught the eye of Ottoman talent scouts. When you met him in the palace corridors 2 years later, he moved with the gliding gait of someone whose body had been fundamentally altered, his voice frozen in the high register of perpetual boyhood. His eyes held an emptiness that went beyond sadness. They reflected the void where his future should have been. "Do you dream of home?" you asked him once, during a moment when the supervisors weren't watching. He looked at you with something that might have been pity. "Home?" he replied. "What home could accept me now? What family would claim a creature like me? The empire took my body, but my village would take my life if I returned to show them what I've become." The eunuch system created its own twisted hierarchy within the palace, with castrated servants often wielding considerable power over intact slaves. The empire understood that giving mutilated men authority over whole ones would create additional layers of psychological control. Eunuchs couldn't rebel by starting families or building outside loyalties. Their investment in the system was complete because they had no other world to which they could return. The most successful eunuchs learned to use their position as both weapon and shield. They became the Sultan's most trusted advisors, precisely because their mutilation guaranteed their loyalty. They couldn't dream of founding dynasties or accumulating power for their descendants because they would have no descendants. Their ambitions were necessarily limited to advancement within the system that had destroyed them. Some eunuchs rose to positions of enormous influence, becoming viziers, governors, and military commanders who shaped the empire's destiny. But they carried with them the psychological scars of their transformation, often becoming the most enthusiastic enforcers of the very system that had brutalized them. The empire had perfected the art of turning victims into perpetrators, ensuring that those who had suffered the most would be the most committed to inflicting similar suffering on others. The religious justifications for this system were as elaborate as they were hypocritical. Ottoman scholars argued that castration purified boys by removing their capacity for sin, that it elevated them above base human desires and made them more suitable for sacred service. They created theological frameworks that portrayed mutilation as mercy, transformation as blessing, and systematic child abuse as religious duty. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the eunuch system was how completely it normalized the destruction of human potential. Visitors to the Ottoman court wrote admiringly of the beautiful young men who served the Sultan, praising their grace, their intelligence, their devoted service. They saw the finished product without understanding the horror of its creation, the machine that transformed innocent children into living ornaments for imperial pleasure. The empire had created a system where the most horrific abuse could be packaged as privilege, where castration could be presented as opportunity, where the complete destruction of a child's future could be celebrated as their elevation to sacred service. It was psychological warfare conducted on the most intimate possible level, turning the human body itself into a battlefield where imperial power could demonstrate its absolute dominion over those it claimed to serve. The palace's entertainment quarters occupied an entire wing of the complex, connected by hidden passages that allowed the Sultan's most treasured performers to move unseen through the maze of marble corridors. This was where you encountered the köçek dancers for the first time, and where your understanding of Ottoman sexual exploitation reached new depths of horror. These weren't simply entertainers, they were living embodiments of the empire's ability to twist human sexuality into something unrecognizable and profoundly disturbing. You first saw them during a palace celebration. Boys who appeared to float rather than walk, their movements so deliberately feminine that it took your traumatized mind several moments to process what you were witnessing. They wore flowing silks dyed in colors, so rich they seemed to absorb light, their faces painted with cosmetics that transformed masculine features into something hauntingly beautiful and deeply unsettling. Jewels caught the lamplight as they moved, creating patterns of brilliance that hypnotized audiences and disguised the nightmare of their existence. Selim had been taken from a Bosnian village when he was 8, chosen not for administrative potential or military service, but for something the Ottoman officials called performance suitability. Now 15, he moved through the palace like a ghost trapped between genders. His natural masculine development arrested through careful application of herbs and hormones that kept his voice high and his body smooth. The transformation wasn't just external, it was a systematic reconstruction of gender identity that left its victims psychologically shattered. "They don't want us to be women," Selim explained during one of your clandestine conversations in the palace gardens. "They want us to be something that never existed in nature. Creatures that combine masculine strength with feminine beauty, but belong to neither world." His voice carried the hollow quality of someone describing his own execution. "We are living dolls, created to fulfill fantasies that require us to be something no human being was ever meant to be." The training process for köçek dancers was a masterclass in psychological manipulation that combined artistic education with systematic sexual conditioning. Boys learned not just dance steps and musical skills, but how to move their bodies in ways that would arouse male audiences while maintaining the pretense of innocent entertainment. They studied the art of seduction while being forbidden to understand their own sexuality, becoming experts in desires they could never fulfill. Palace dance masters, many of them former köçek dancers themselves, taught these boys to use their bodies as instruments of manipulation and control. They learned to read the faces of their audiences, to identify which movements would drive specific men to distraction, to calibrate their performances, to extract maximum response, while avoiding the kind of frenzy that might result in immediate sexual assault. It was a delicate balance that required them to become experts in male psychology while remaining ignorant of their own humanity. The performances themselves took place in chambers designed specifically for this purpose, intimate spaces where the line between entertainment and prostitution was deliberately blurred. The audience consisted of high-ranking officials, foreign dignitaries, and wealthy merchants who had purchased the privilege of witnessing these exclusive shows. They reclined on silk cushions, drinking wine that was forbidden to most Muslims, while boys who should have been playing with toys instead performed elaborate seductions that would culminate in their own violation. But the köçek system was merely the visible portion of something far more sinister. The tavşanalan network, a secret infrastructure that supplied children specifically for the sexual gratification of Ottoman elites. The term translates roughly to bunny boys, a euphemism so obscene in its innocence that it perfectly captured the empire's talent for disguising atrocity as privilege. These boys had no official status, no protection under law, no hope of advancement or eventual freedom. They existed solely as sexual objects, hidden away from public view and historical record. The tavşanalan system operated through a network of private collectors who specialized in acquiring children with specific physical characteristics. Unlike the Devshirme, which was conducted openly as imperial policy, this trade flourished in the shadows, servicing officials whose appetites were considered extreme even by Ottoman standards. The children acquired through this network were typically younger, often under 10, and were subjected to conditioning that was designed to make them compliant sexual partners before they were old enough to understand what was happening to them. Palace records that survived in hidden archives reveal the bureaucratic precision with which even this most secret system operated. Officials maintained detailed inventories of available children, categorized by age, appearance, and what they euphemistically called training level. They tracked which boys were assigned to which masters, documented their preferences and reactions, and maintained quality control measures that treated human beings like manufactured goods subject to performance standards. The psychological conditioning of tavşanalan boys was perhaps the most sophisticated form of child abuse ever institutionalized by any government. These children weren't just physically exploited, they were mentally reconstructed to believe that their abuse constituted love, that their suffering represented privilege, that their complete powerlessness was actually a form of special status. They were taught to compete for the attention of their abusers, to take pride in their ability to please masters, to view other children not as fellow victims, but as rivals for access to the affection of their tormentors. The empire had discovered that children could be conditioned to participate enthusiastically in their own exploitation if the process was introduced gradually and packaged as education or advancement. Boys as young as 7 learned to read the moods of adult men, to anticipate their desires, to modify their behavior, to maximize the pleasure they provided. They became experts in adult sexuality, while being completely denied any understanding of their own developing needs and desires. The international dimension of these practices reveals how the Ottoman system corrupted diplomatic relations across Europe and beyond. Foreign ambassadors and merchants who visited Constantinople wrote detailed accounts of the entertainment they witnessed, but framed their observations in language that obscured the systematic child abuse they were describing. They spoke of exotic customs and sophisticated entertainment, rather than acknowledging that they were witnessing the sexual exploitation of children on an industrial scale. Some visitors became customers themselves, using their diplomatic immunity to purchase access to services that would have been considered criminal in their home countries. The empire had created a form of sexual tourism that attracted the wealthy and powerful from across the known world, all of whom returned home with carefully coded stories about Ottoman hospitality that never mentioned the children whose lives were destroyed to provide their entertainment. The tavşanalan system's secrecy meant that these boys lived in a world completely severed from any external oversight or protection. Unlike other palace servants who might occasionally interact with visitors or diplomats, these children existed in isolation so complete that they might as well have been on another planet. Their disappearance from the world was so total that families never learned what had become of them, creating a form of ambiguous loss that traumatized entire communities for generations. The empire's ability to maintain this system for centuries reveals something disturbing about human nature's capacity to normalize atrocity. Palace servants who weren't directly involved learned to ignore what they witnessed, to treat systematic child abuse as simply another aspect of imperial luxury. The bureaucrats who managed the system wrote reports and maintained budgets with the same professional detachment they brought to any other administrative task. As you learned to navigate this world of carefully orchestrated horror, you began to understand that the empire's sexual practices weren't aberrations or cultural differences. They were weapons of psychological warfare designed to demonstrate absolute power over the most intimate aspects of human experience. The message was clear. If the empire could take children and transform them into willing participants in their own sexual exploitation, then no aspect of human dignity was beyond imperial reach. The köçek dancers and tavşanalan boys represented the empire's ultimate triumph over human nature itself. The creation of victims so thoroughly broken that they became enthusiastic collaborators in the system that had destroyed. To them, you watched these performances with growing horror, recognizing in the painted faces and graceful movements the ghosts of boys who had once been whole, now transformed into living symbols of Ottoman power over the human soul. The slave markets of Constantinople operated with the efficiency of modern corporations, but their product was human flesh measured, categorized, and sold according to a complex hierarchy that reduced women to mere merchandise. The Grand Bazaar's hidden sections housed what Ottoman records euphemistically called the flower markets. Vast chambers where thousands of women and girls were displayed for purchase, like exotic goods from distant lands. You witnessed these markets during your advanced training, when older students were taken to observe commercial operations that funded the empire's expansion. The sight that greeted you defied comprehension. Women arranged in rows according to precise categories. African girls from Sudan and Ethiopia, their dark skin gleaming with oils applied to enhance their market value. European women from Greece, Serbia, and Bulgaria, prized for their lighter complexions and what buyers considered more refined features. Circassian beauties from the Caucasus, legendary for their stunning appearances and commanding the highest prices in the empire's flesh trade. The pricing structure revealed the cold arithmetic of human commodification. A typical African girl might sell for 1,500 to 2,500 axes if intended for household work. But if she was destined for sexual use, the price could double or triple overnight. European women commanded even higher prices, with some selling for amounts equivalent to small fortunes. The most expensive category was reserved for what the Ottomans called odalisque candidates, women specifically trained for sexual service in imperial harems. But behind each price tag was a human being torn from everything she had ever known. Amara had been a blacksmith's daughter in Nubia before raiders destroyed her village and marched her north in chains. Now she stood naked on a marble platform, while potential buyers examined her body like connoisseurs evaluating a sculpture. The auctioneer's voice echoed through the chamber as he described her attributes: her age, her region of origin, her physical condition, her supposed temperament. He mentioned her intact virtue and breeding potential, as if she were livestock being prepared for stud. The buyers circled with the predatory patience of sharks, their discussions conducted in whispers that nonetheless carried clearly in the stone chamber. A wealthy merchant pointed out the strength in her legs, suitable for long hours of labor. A palace official noted the symmetry of her features, perfect for decorative purposes. A provincial governor's representative calculated her potential for producing children who might themselves be valuable as slaves or soldiers. Elena had been captured during an Ottoman raid on a Greek island, pulled from her father's fishing boat while her family watched helplessly from the shore. At 16, she possessed the kind of beauty that made grown men forget their dignity. But her value in the marketplace was measured not by her intelligence or character, but by her fertility and her ability to please masters she had never chosen. The bidding for her services became a competition between men who discussed her body with the casual intimacy of old friends sharing wine. The most disturbing aspect of these markets was how they had been integrated into Constantinople's social fabric. Wealthy families brought their wives and daughters to shop for household servants, teaching their own children to evaluate human beings like furniture or artwork. Young Ottoman nobles learned to see slavery not as an unfortunate necessity, but as a normal part of civilized life. Their moral education, warped by exposure to systematic dehumanization, presented as commercial enterprise. The empire maintained training facilities where captured women were transformed into polished commodities, their natural personalities erased and replaced with carefully constructed personas designed to maximize their market value. These institutions, hidden in the maze of Constantinople's backstreets, operated like finishing schools for sexual slavery, teaching women the arts of seduction, massage, music, and dance while systematically destroying their capacity for independent thought or resistance. Fatima had been a merchant's daughter in Damascus before political upheaval left her family vulnerable to Ottoman slave hunters. Now she endured daily lessons in what her instructors called feminine accomplishments: how to move her body to attract male attention, how to use cosmetics to enhance her natural beauty, how to speak in the soft, submissive tones that buyers found appealing. But the most crucial part of her education involved learning to participate enthusiastically in her own exploitation, to smile convincingly while her soul died inside. The training process was designed to break down resistance through a combination of physical conditioning and psychological manipulation that would make modern experts in trauma psychology weep. Women were taught that their only value lay in their ability to please men, that their intelligence and creativity were irrelevant except as tools for better serving their masters' desires. They learned to compete with each other for the privilege of being selected by buyers. Their natural bonds of sisterhood corrupted into weapons of mutual destruction. The scale of this human marketplace was staggering beyond imagination. Constantinople alone housed an estimated 400,000 enslaved people at any given time, with women and girls comprising roughly half that number. The empire's expansion into Africa, Eastern Europe, and the Caucasus was driven partly by the insatiable demand for fresh supplies of human flesh. Military campaigns were planned not just for territorial gain, but for human acquisition, with commanders calculating how many people they could expect to capture from each conquest. The harem system that consumed many of these women represented the ultimate expression of Ottoman sexual exploitation. Popular imagination pictures harems as luxurious spaces filled with pampered concubines living lives of idle pleasure. But this romanticized vision bears no resemblance to historical reality. Most harem women lived in conditions of constant terror, competing desperately for the attention that might elevate them from mere slaves to favored concubines. The competition was deliberately fostered by the system's design, creating environments where women were pitted against each other in elaborate displays designed to entertain their masters. They were forced to perform increasingly degrading acts to distinguish themselves from their rivals, their desperation carefully cultivated and exploited by men who found their suffering arousing. Those who failed to please faced punishments that ranged from beatings and starvation to outright execution, their bodies disposed of with the same casual efficiency used to discard broken furniture. Within the imperial harem itself, the Sultan's personal collection of over 1,000 women, the psychological warfare reached levels of sophistication that defied comprehension. Women were encouraged to inform on each other, to sabotage rivals, to form temporary alliances that could be broken at any moment. The empire had created an environment where the natural bonds between women were corrupted into weapons of mutual destruction, ensuring that potential conspiracies could never develop because trust itself had been weaponized. The fate of children born within this system reveals perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Ottoman sexual practices. Mixed-race children, particularly those born to African mothers, were often killed immediately after birth, their existence seen as inconvenient complications in the machinery of sexual exploitation. Contemporary observers noted the absence of mixed-race children in Constantinople despite the obvious presence of thousands of African women living in sexual relationships with Turkish men. The conclusion was inescapable. These children were being systematically eliminated to maintain the racial hierarchies that the empire considered essential to its social order. Those children who were allowed to live faced fates that were often worse than death. Boys might be castrated and added to the eunuch ranks, while girls were groomed from infancy to become the next generation of harem slaves. The empire had created a self-perpetuating cycle of sexual exploitation that consumed not just individual lives, but entire family lines across generations. Children born into slavery knew no other world, making their compliance even more complete than that of those who remembered freedom. The economic infrastructure supporting this system reveals how deeply sexual exploitation was embedded in the empire's foundation. The slave trade wasn't a side business, it was a pillar of imperial finance, generating revenues that funded military expansion, palace construction, and administrative operations. The empire's budget literally depended on the systematic destruction of human dignity across 3 continents, making reform impossible without threatening the entire structure of Ottoman power. The legal framework supporting this system reveals how deeply embedded sexual exploitation was in Ottoman governance, creating a 2-tiered system of human worth that made systematic sexual violence not just legal, but economically rational. The empire's Sharia-based legal codes explicitly stated that raping a free Muslim woman carried the death penalty, while sexually assaulting a slave woman resulted in a fine equivalent to damaging someone's property. The message was clear. Humanity itself was conditional, determined not by birth or inherent dignity, but by legal status assigned by imperial decree. The Kanuni Osmani, the empire's secular legal code, went even further in codifying sexual exploitation. It established detailed regulations governing the sexual use of slaves, specifying which types of abuse were permitted, which required compensation to owners, and which constituted criminal damage to valuable property. The law didn't protect slaves from sexual violence. It regulated that violence to ensure maximum economic efficiency while maintaining social order. Court records from across the empire document how this legal framework operated in practice. A janissary officer who raped his Greek slave girl faced no criminal charges, but was required to pay her owner 50 axes for diminishing her market value. A merchant who killed a Circassian concubine during a sexual assault paid a fine of 200 axes, less than the cost of a good horse. The empire had created a system where human life was literally valued below animal livestock. The systematic nature of this legal oppression extended to the empire's educational institutions, where children were taught from their earliest years that sexual violence against certain populations was not just acceptable, but divinely sanctioned. Islamic schools throughout Ottoman territory used textbooks that explicitly justified the sexual enslavement of non-Muslims as a religious duty, portraying rape and abuse as tools for converting infidels to the true faith. Young Ottoman nobles learned that their sexual desires, no matter how extreme or violent, could be legitimately satisfied through the empire's human marketplace. They grew up understanding that consent was irrelevant when dealing with slaves, that resistance was a crime punishable by death, and that the suffering of their victims was either irrelevant or actively desirable. The empire had created generations of men who viewed sexual violence as their birthright. Public executions became festivals of sexual torture that revealed the depths of Ottoman society's moral corruption. The empire didn't just punish sexual crimes, it turned those punishments into elaborate spectacles where sexual humiliation served as the main attraction. Criminals convicted of adultery or rape faced deaths designed to mirror their crimes in the most degrading ways possible. But the audience participation transformed these events into communal celebrations of sexual violence. The execution of Mehmet the Butcher in 1623 exemplifies how completely the empire had normalized sexual torture as entertainment. Convicted of raping several slave women belonging to different masters, Mehmet faced a punishment designed to both deter similar crimes and provide vicarious satisfaction to the crowds. The execution lasted 7 hours, during which time he was systematically mutilated while thousands of spectators cheered, placed bets on his endurance, and shouted suggestions for additional torments. But the most disturbing aspect wasn't the torture itself, it was how the crowd responded. Families brought children to witness these spectacles, teaching them that sexual violence was not just permissible but entertaining when directed against the right targets. Vendors sold food and drinks to spectators, treating human suffering like any other form of public amusement. Religious officials blessed the proceedings, declaring that the victim's agony served divine justice. The empire's diplomatic correspondence reveals how these practices affected international relations, creating a culture of sexual exploitation that extended far beyond Ottoman borders. Foreign ambassadors wrote detailed reports about the sexual horrors they witnessed, but framed them as cultural differences rather than human rights violations. European powers that might have intervened were too busy profiting from Ottoman trade routes to risk diplomatic incidents over the fate of enslaved children and women. Venetian diplomatic archives contain hundreds of letters describing Ottoman sexual practices in clinical detail, but recommending continued commercial relations despite the obvious moral problems. French ambassadors documented the systematic rape of Christian captives, then negotiated trade agreements that enriched both empires while ignoring the human cost. The international community had become complicit in Ottoman sexual exploitation through its willingness to prioritize profit over human welfare. The empire's influence spread these practices far beyond its borders through what can only be described as sexual colonialism. Ottoman sexual customs were adopted by client states and trading partners, who saw them as sophisticated approaches to population management and social control. The systematic exploitation of sexuality became a model that other powers emulated, spreading the empire's particular brand of sexual violence across the known world. The Crimean Khanate, nominally independent but effectively an Ottoman client state, developed its own versions of the Devshirme system and harem networks. Barbary corsairs operating under Ottoman protection specialized in capturing European women for the Constantinople slave markets, their raids extending as far as Ireland and Iceland. The empire had created an international network of sexual exploitation that turned the Mediterranean into a hunting ground for human flesh. Perhaps most revealing was how Ottoman officials integrated sexual violence into their routine administrative duties. Provincial governors were expected to maintain quotas, not just for tax collection and military recruitment, but for the acquisition of attractive slaves for imperial use. Their performance reviews included assessments of their success in procuring beautiful women and boys, making sexual exploitation a criterion for career advancement. The bureaucratic records show how completely this system had corrupted Ottoman governance. Officials wrote reports about slave acquisition with the same professional detachment they brought to discussions of grain harvests or military logistics. They maintained detailed correspondence about the sexual preferences of their superiors, treating human trafficking as just another aspect of imperial administration. The religious establishment's role in legitimizing these practices reveals the profound moral corruption that had infected every level of Ottoman society. Islamic scholars produced elaborate theological justifications for practices that violated the most basic principles of human decency, creating legal frameworks that portrayed sexual slavery as religious duty rather than criminal exploitation. The empire's madrasas taught young clerics that enslaving and sexually exploiting non-Muslims was not just permissible but recommended as a means of demonstrating Islamic superiority. They learned to quote Quranic verses out of context, to justify practices that contradicted the essential spirit of their own faith, becoming theologians of exploitation who provided divine sanction for human trafficking networks. This systematic corruption of religious authority meant that potential sources of moral opposition to sexual exploitation were instead transformed into its most articulate defenders. The very institutions that should have protected the vulnerable instead became advocates for their destruction, creating a form of spiritual poison that contaminated Ottoman society at its deepest levels. As the Ottoman Empire finally began its slow collapse in the 19th and 20th centuries, the sexual exploitation systems that had operated for centuries didn't simply vanish into historical footnotes. They evolved, adapted, and left psychological scars that would haunt entire populations for generations to come. The infrastructure of human trafficking that had supplied the empire's appetite for flesh had created cultural patterns and social attitudes that proved far more durable than the political system that had originally fostered them. The abolition of slavery in the Ottoman Empire came not from moral awakening, but from external pressure and economic necessity. European powers, driven by their own imperial ambitions and moral reforms, began demanding that the Ottomans conform to international standards that no longer tolerated open human trafficking. But the empire's response revealed how deeply sexual exploitation had become embedded in its social fabric. They didn't eliminate the practices so much as drive them underground and disguise them with new legal terminology. The formal end of the Devshirme system in 1826 was proclaimed with great fanfare, but administrative records show that child acquisition continued through networks of adoption agencies and educational institutions that served the same function under different names. Boys were still taken from Christian families, still subjected to forced conversion and sexual conditioning, still transformed into servants for Ottoman elites. The empire had simply learned to hide its crimes behind paperwork that made systematic child abuse appear as charitable work. When you finally escaped the palace system in 1578, after 8 years of systematic abuse disguised as education, you carried with you not just physical scars, but a psychological damage that modern trauma specialists would recognize as complex PTSD. Your capacity for normal human relationships had been systematically destroyed and rebuilt around patterns of submission and survival that made civilian life almost impossible to navigate. The boy who had once herded sheep in Bulgarian mountains was gone, replaced by someone who flinched at unexpected touches, who calculated the sexual preferences of every man he encountered, who could speak 5 languages fluently but had forgotten how to express genuine emotion in any of them. The empire had achieved its goal. You were a perfectly trained servant, capable of anticipating needs and managing complex social situations, but incapable of forming the kind of authentic human connections that might threaten your loyalty to the system that had created you. Thousands of men like you emerged from Ottoman institutions carrying similar psychological cargo, their damaged psyches seeding new generations of dysfunction throughout the territories they governed. Former palace slaves who rose to positions of power often became the most brutal administrators, their own trauma expressing itself through the systematic oppression of populations under their control. The empire had created a cycle of abuse that perpetuated itself through the very people it had victimized. The genetic legacy of Ottoman sexual practices can still be traced through population studies across 3 continents. The empire's systematic rape of enslaved women left biological evidence in the form of genetic markers that reveal the scope of sexual violence across centuries. Modern DNA analysis of populations in the Balkans, Caucasus, and sub-Saharan Africa shows clear patterns of forced admixture that correspond exactly to known periods of Ottoman expansion and slave raiding. But the genetic evidence tells only part of the story. The cultural trauma inflicted by Ottoman sexual practices created psychological patterns that persisted long after the empire's collapse. Communities that had lost generations of children to the Devshirme system developed what anthropologists now recognize as collective PTSD, manifesting in social behaviors, cultural practices, and family structures that reflected centuries of systematic victimization. Villages in the Balkans still maintain customs that originated as protection against Ottoman child collectors. Specific prayers, hidden rooms, coded signals that warned of approaching danger. These traditions, passed down through oral history, preserve the memory of terror in communities that are officially encouraged to forget their suffering in the name of modern diplomatic relations. The archaeological evidence continues to emerge from excavation sites across former Ottoman territories, revealing the physical infrastructure that supported systematic sexual exploitation. Excavations at palace sites have uncovered specialized chambers designed for sexual torture, complete with restraining devices and drainage systems that suggest practices too horrific for contemporary accounts to describe explicitly. Mass graves near former castration centers contain the remains of thousands of boys who didn't survive the procedures, their bones bearing evidence of the crude surgical techniques and deliberate mutilation that characterized the empire's approach to human modification. These discoveries provide undeniable physical proof of atrocities that Ottoman apologists still attempt to minimize or explain away as exaggerated propaganda. The international implications of Ottoman sexual practices extended far beyond the empire's borders, creating networks of human trafficking and sexual exploitation that influenced global patterns of abuse for centuries. The empire's methods were studied and adapted by other powers, spreading techniques of systematic sexual violence across continents and cultures that had previously limited their exploitation to more traditional forms of slavery and conquest. European colonial powers adopted Ottoman approaches to sexual exploitation, applying them in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, with modifications suited to local conditions. The Spanish encomienda system, British colonial administration, and French imperial policies all showed clear influences from Ottoman precedents, creating a global infrastructure of sexual violence that persisted well into the modern era. Perhaps most tragically, the normalization of sexual exploitation within Ottoman society created cultural attitudes that survived the empire's political collapse. The idea that certain populations could be legitimately subjected to sexual violence, that beauty was a commodity to be harvested and sold, that childhood innocence was an obstacle to be overcome rather than protected. These concepts found new expressions in the modern world's approach to human trafficking, child exploitation, and sexual tourism. Today, as we examine this dark chapter of human history, we're confronted with uncomfortable parallels to contemporary practices that echo Ottoman methods with disturbing precision. The systematic exploitation of vulnerable children in global trafficking networks, the commodification of sexuality through modern technology, the creation of legal frameworks that protect perpetrators while criminalizing victims, all of these reflect patterns that the Ottoman Empire perfected centuries ago. The boys taken from Balkan villages, the women sold in Constantinople's flesh markets, the children murdered. To maintain racial hierarchies, their stories demand to be remembered not as exotic historical curiosities, but as testimonies to human resilience in the face of institutionalized cruelty. They represent millions of victims whose names were never recorded, whose suffering was never acknowledged, whose humanity was denied by systems that valued power over compassion. The wooden cross that was torn from your neck on that first day in Constantinople may have been destroyed, but the spirit it represented, the recognition of inherent human dignity that transcends political power or social status, survived in the whispered prayers of enslaved children, the secret resistance of brutalized women, and the refusal of victims to completely surrender their souls to the machines designed to consume them. Their legacy is both warning and inspiration. Warning about the speed with which civilized societies can abandon basic human decency when it serves their interests, and inspiration drawn from the countless acts of courage, compassion, and resistance that flourished even in the darkest corners of Ottoman oppression. The empire that seemed so permanent, so powerful, so successful in its exploitation of human weakness, ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, leaving behind only ruins and memories and the eternal testimony of those who refused to let their humanity be completely erased. In remembering their stories, we honor not just their individual suffering, but our own responsibility to recognize and resist the systems of exploitation that continue to operate in new forms throughout our modern world. The ghosts of Ottoman victims still walk among us, demanding that we learn from their pain and ensure that such systematic destruction of human dignity never again masquerades as the natural order of civilization.